Well, good evening to anybody who is out there. This is the beginning of my live stream, getting ready for my talk on Richard III and the Princes in the Tower. So this is just a 10-minute build up to allow people to get in. And the talk will start at 7 o'clock. Hi, Aya. Lovely to see you. Aya, can you just confirm if you can see a comment from me talking about the PDF of the images that accompany the talk? Because I'm not sure it's posted it. It'd be lovely to see, just get some confirmation from someone who can see at the other end. Let's sort this out as well. It's a bit high. You can't see it. Okay, well, it doesn't seem to have posted for some unknown reason. That's weird. Okay, let's try that again. Oh, very odd. I wonder why it's not letting me post it. That's weird. Ah, now it's interesting. It's gone through. Ah, there it is. Cool. Okay, so if you haven't picked up the images, do pick them up if you want to follow them on a different tab. That would be cool. Excellent, that's great. Right, so I'm glad that's all working. Thank you for helping me out with that one. So just to say to anybody who's coming in that the talk will start in 5 minutes at 7 o'clock. So I can see there's 4 people out there. So hi, guys. Nice to have you here. Do say hi, by the way. That's still too high. Still trying to get the camera right. There we are. No, it's still too high. Let's see if I can fix this. Yeah, looking better. just to say, if you're out there joining me for this talk this evening and you want to be able to drop comments, you will need to sign in. You'll need an account with Facebook. You'll need to sign in. That's a bit of a limitation that we have. But if you're able to just drop a comment to say hi and let me know that you're out there, that'd be fantastic. And if you want to ask any questions during the talk, please do. And also, if you've come in the last 5 minutes, just to say at the top of the chat board there, I've left a comment with a link to access the PDF of the images that accompany this talk. There, you'll find them on Google Drive. And the talk's going to get going in about 3 minutes. Hi there. Not sure I know the name, but Blackie306, hi and welcome. We'll get going in just a moment. So it's at 7 o'clock. Let's get going. Oh, hi, Toby. Lovely to see you. Right then. Well, welcome everyone to this talk on Richard III and the Princes in the Tower. I am utterly delighted that this has actually worked. If you were trying to access this talk 2 weeks ago, and we had a bit of a technological disaster on Facebook, but I am most pleased to find that this is all working just fine. So great to have you all here, and to anyone who's coming in. So there is a PDF of images that you can access if you want to. If you have a look at the top of the chat board, I've posted the link there. And also, if you came to this talk from my advert on Facebook, the link is also included in the advert on Facebook as well, so you can go and grab the images and follow them along as we do the talk. Okay, lovely, Toby. I'm looking forward to seeing your mum as well. That's great. Okay, so Richard III and the Princes in the Tower, one of the most compelling mysteries of British history ever. I think it's one of those things that will give historians and laymen alike lots of things to talk about for decades, if not centuries to come. It's been a matter of debate ever since it first happened, because in 1483, when it first happened, even then opinion was divided. Hi, Lucy, lovely to see you. So, you know, obviously people have been arguing over it ever since, and it's one of my favorite things to teach. So I do this with lots of classes of students, and we've had some great debates on this one. Obviously, opinion is sharply divided. So I'm going to go over the evidence, give you the background evidence, and then invite you all to make your own verdict by the end of this session. Now, one of the things I find that happens a great deal is that a lot of people come down on the side of Henry VII, Henry Tudor, as being responsible for it, which really surprises me. So it'd be interesting to see what your opinions are. I'm just going to pause for a moment, actually, and those of you who are able to, would you like to tell me what you think so far on what you know about the mystery of the princes in the Tower? Who you think might be responsible? Richard III or Henry Tudor? Perhaps you might like to pop a comment onto the chat board just for a moment, and we'll just take a quick straw poll of what opinion is before we start looking at the evidence. Okay, thanks, Lucy. So Lucy's looking at it being Richard. I'll just give it a minute. Yeah, I has gone for Richard as well. Okay, Toby's divided. Hi, Denise. Welcome in. Lovely to see you. Okay, that's fine. Do you think Richard's more likely, Toby? Okay, that's cool. I must admit, my personal opinion is that it was Richard that was most likely responsible for this, but I'm going to present the evidence from as objective a point of view as possible. I'm not going to try and persuade you either way. I'm going to present the evidence, and you, like a jury, can have a go at what you think. And the great thing about this, obviously, is that we don't know. We simply don't know. So yeah, let's see whether opinions get changed at all by the end of the talk. Okay, so if you're following the images, and those of you who come in a bit later, I put the link for the images a bit further up. Yes, I agree with you, Lucy. Absolutely. She's saying that I don't think Henry would have had the opportunity. Let's go and have a look at the evidence. Let's see what we think. Okay, so if you're following the images, you've got image 1 there, which is the princes in the Tower. That's our little introductory. Please go to image 2. Why the Tower of London? Why were the princes in the Tower? Let's clear up something straight away. They weren't initially imprisoned. It was the summer of 1483, and the young Edward V, he was only 12 years old, he and his brother Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, had lost their father, King Edward IV, the Yorkist king, unexpectedly. He died before his time, even for a medieval person, in the April of 1485. And the normal procedure for a new monarch was, wherever they were in the country, they would make their way to London, and they would make their way to the Tower of London. That was the traditional place from which to make coronation preparations. So it was completely normal for them to arrive in London, albeit under the protectorship of their uncle, as opposed to their guardian, Earl Rivers, but we'll go into that a bit later, and for them to go straight to the Tower and to be resident from there, because on the day before your coronation, what you did was you had a big procession through the city of London. Think of an American ticker tape parade. So the streets were all decorated, and there were pageants, and there was wine flowing, and everybody was in their best, and the streets were decorated. So you had this big procession to the Palace of Westminster, and then on coronation day, you processed from the Palace of Westminster up to Westminster Abbey. And hello to my daughter. Hi there. And so it was totally normal for the boys to be there. What wasn't normal was what happened afterwards. But that's why they were in the Tower, because at first they were there as the monarch and his brother preparing for the coronation. But as time went on, that changed, and they became truly prisoners within the Tower, and then, of course, disappeared altogether. Okay, so let's go to image 3 and have a look at a very romanticized Victorian view of the two boys. Who were they? As I've just said, King Edward V, he was 12 years old, and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, the Duke of York, who was 10. And as I say, they were on the Yorkist side. We are still in the last years of the Wars of the Roses. They kind of assumed it had all been settled by then. Of course, that wasn't to be, because Richard III was going to die on Bosworth Field in 1485 while fighting the Tudors, fighting Henry Tudor and his supporters, which meant that the Lancastrian faction eventually won the Wars of the Roses. But we're still a little way off from that. So these guys were on the Yorkist side, and their father, Richard III, obviously had been a great supporter of the Yorkist King Edward IV, and I was talking about that in my previous talk. Okay, now this picture is something that has a little place in my heart because the original is in the gallery of Royal Holloway, University of London, down at Egham, and that's where I did my Masters in Medieval Studies. So I remember going and seeing it during a reception that they gave us when I first signed on for my MA, and they kind of greeted us and gave us nice canapes, and there was the original painting. So it was, yeah, it's only a little thing, but it was lovely to see that painting. Okay, if you're following the images, on image 4, you will see a picture of King Edward IV and his Queen, Elizabeth Woodville. Now, the situation, I'm going to go through a timeline in just a moment of leading up to the Princess in the Tower disappearing. And the backstory was Elizabeth Woodville and her faction, her relatives. There were quite a lot of them, and they had won favour in the eyes of Edward IV. But there wasn't that much love between the Woodville faction and Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who was going to become Richard III. There was a lot of bad blood between them, and a bitter rivalry for control of the young Edward V once Edward IV died. It was a fairly dangerous situation on both sides, because whoever got power would be able to seriously harm the other. So Elizabeth Woodville and her faction, if they had gained complete power over the king, Richard would have been pushed out, and he would probably have been harmed in some way. And the Woodvilles were afraid that Richard would do the same to them. So there was a lot of pulling and pushing and a lot of bad blood with the in-laws, so to speak. And of course, if you've watched the series or read the books, The White Queen, you might have heard of those by Philippa Gregory. This is the White Queen, Elizabeth Woodville. Okay, so that's for the parents of the two boys. Now then, let me give you the traditional narrative. The traditional narrative, if you go to image 5, that's right, is that the two boys were imprisoned by their nefarious uncle, who had decided from as soon as he could after the death of Edward IV, some people say even before, they had decided to usurp the throne from the word go. And if you believe what Shakespeare says, he was going to smile and be a villain, was determined to be a villain and to do away with the two boys, and that the two boys were imprisoned in the tower, and at his orders or by his hand were smothered to death with pillows and then buried under a staircase in the White Tower. That's kind of the traditional narrative. Hi, Ruth. Welcome in. Great to see you. There you go. I kept my promise, Ruth. Okay, but let's have a look at what actually happened and why Richard usurped the crown. That's really important that we think about that. Is why was he after the throne in the first place, and why would he have removed the boys on his own orders? So I'm just going to give you a few thoughts about this. We know that between April and the beginning of July, Richard went through a whole process of usurping the throne, which I'll go through in a timeline in just a second. But why? Here's some reasons why. There was concern about the influence of the Woodville family, and Elizabeth Woodville herself was unpopular, and there may have been a general desire to remove them. Okay, also Edward IV's sudden death, it took everybody by surprise. And one theory is that Richard III saw an opportunity and seized it. And my daughter will be laughing. It's a bit of an in-joke. But yeah, I mean, it seemed completely out of character for Richard because he had been a very faithful supporter of his brother. He had shown no signs whatsoever of wanting to usurp the throne. He'd been trusted with leading the king's campaigns in Scotland. He was Edward's right-hand man. And so it just seemed completely out of character. There doesn't seem to have been, in my opinion, or in the Richard III Society's opinion either, a pre-plan to go and pinch the throne. But something happened, something clicked in Richard's head at some point, and the decision, for whatever reason, was made. Another possible reason is rivalry even with the Woodvilles. The usurpation might be considered to have begun as an action against the Woodvilles, but events carried on too far. A suggestion that Richard had started a train of events when he intercepted the king. Edward V was on his way from Ludlow to London shortly after the death of his father, and at a place called Stony Stratford, he was with his guardian, Earl Rivers, who was Elizabeth Woodville's brother, and Richard had hot-footed it down from his castle of Middleham in Yorkshire and met them at Stony Stratford. And again, at that point, he seemed to be just kind of joining in. But within 24 hours, he had arrested Earl Rivers and taken personal control of the king. So what was that about? Was there an idea planted in his head at that point that kind of pushed him over the edge? We'll think about that a little bit more later on. Richard's background is the Wars of the Roses. He'd grown up with family members ousting, killing, and plotting against one another in pursuit of power. This was nothing out of the ordinary. Doesn't make it right. It's still horrific what happened. Don't get me wrong. But it was, you know, actually very usual to get rid of your previous rival. He was brought up in an atmosphere of ruthlessness and violence. He'd watched his brother do that. So one suggestion is that he was acting as he'd been trained to. Also, there was uncertainty over how the kingdom would be ruled following the death of Edward IV, because Edward V, the new young king, he was 12, so he was not old enough to have a full-blown regent, a stand-in, to actually do the ruling on his behalf. But he was not yet old enough to be able to rule by himself. So you needed a kind of in-between, a protector of some kind, and there was some argument as to who that was going to be. Richard III definitely wanted that position. Elizabeth Woodville and her faction wanted to be able to choose who that should be, and they certainly didn't want Richard in that position. Could it be that Richard's ambition perhaps pushed him into seizing power to make sure that he wouldn't be pushed out by the Woodvilles? Yes, maybe Ptolemy all over again. Exactly. I think it's the same kind of playing out the power struggles that you see again and again over history. So on my notes here, I'll just read what I've got here. Concern about a minority government. A minority government meant you would inevitably have pushing and pulling. You'd have struggles among nobility. You get divisions into factions. You could end up with a civil war. It's just something that scared the nobility witless, was a minority, and they would do anything they could to avoid it. So was that the plan? So we'll have a see about that. So the council, there was a council that had been brought together by Edward IV, and this council had quite a lot of Woodvilles on it. And there was concern that the Woodvilles would be able to exercise considerable control over the king through this council. And Edward V had been raised by the Woodvilles, by Elizabeth, and particularly by Earl Rivers. And he was under the, as I say, under the governance of Lord Rivers. He was his kind of tutor and his guardian, looking after him and supervising his growing up. So obviously he would favour the Woodville faction over Richard. So was that something that Richard had to try and do something about? He also had very powerful and ambitious supporters, including the Duke of Buckingham, who actually is one of the suspects in this mystery. And it's been suggested that his powerful supporters expected the kind of rewards that only a king could give. Was Richard pushed into pinching the throne and getting rid of the boys because of the expectations that had been placed on him? Possibly. What I find suspicious is the fact that Buckingham was with Richard as he met the king and Earl Rivers at Stony Stratford, and they sat talking till late in the night, and the next morning Richard then made his first move. So was Buckingham behind it all? Was he, as they say, the grey eminence? This is a bit of a French reference. Was he kind of the shadowy guy behind the throne type thing, pushing Richard into doing these things? Who knows? Richard also, as is well known, he raised doubts about Edward IV's legitimacy because he suggested he'd actually been born out of a marriage that wasn't valid, and that would have offended the morals of the time. So did that give him the chance? There's been suggestions that that was more of an excuse, and I think he did use it as an excuse, most definitely. So those are the kind of theories that were flowing around at the time. Now then, okay, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I'm going to take you through the timeline of what we call the usurpation crisis of the summer of 1483. This is the series of events that happened, and we will look at the suspects very shortly, but let's have a look at the series of events that happened. And again, you can perhaps debate in your own mind what you think was going on. So we start with April the 9th, 1483. Edward IV dies unexpectedly and is succeeded by his eldest son, who becomes King Edward V. At the same time, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, within a short time after, is proclaimed the Lord Protector shortly after. But the Woodvilles decide that they're going to crown Edward V, confirm him as king as soon as possible. Partly it's been suggested so that Richard cannot prevent the king from being crowned and extend his protectorship. Okay, so they're trying to cut Richard's time of power as short as they can. So they send for him from Ludlow, accompanied by his uncle, Earl Rivers. On April the 30th, at Stony Stratford, Richard meets up with the king's party and has dinner with Rivers and Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham. Everything seems very friendly. Okay, there's no whiff of anything suspicious going on at that point, but Rivers retires to the king's camp, which is nearby, and Richard of Gloucester and the Duke of Buckingham talk late into the night. And this is where it gets interesting. The next morning, May the 1st, Richard abruptly has Rivers and his half-brother who's with him, Richard Grey, arrested and taken off to his northern seat of Middleham Castle. Richard takes control of the king and escorts him to London, arriving on the 4th of May. Having heard the news of Richard taking the king into his control, Elizabeth Woodville, her daughters, and Richard of Shrewsbury, the king's younger brother, the Duke of York, have taken refuge in the abbot's house at Westminster Abbey. Now, what goes on is that the king arrives, Edward V arrives with Richard of Gloucester, with his uncle, and he goes to the Tower of London. But Elizabeth Woodville is staying in sanctuary with the younger boy and with his older sister, Elizabeth of York. On the 10th to the 11th of June, however, actually, let me just jump back a little bit. In the intervening time, Richard summons the people of London, the main leaders of London, the officials of London, to swear an oath of loyalty to his nephew, Edward V, which is really interesting because, again, okay, he's taken control of the king, he's got his protectorship, but he's still getting people to swear an oath of loyalty. And at this point, Edward is still safe in the Tower of London, preparing for his coronation. But on the 10th to 11th of June, Richard of Gloucester writes to Ralph Lord Neville, who is a powerful northern lord and the one of his relatives. He writes to the city of York, which is one of his main power bases, and other supporters to ask for their support against the Queen and her supporters, whom he suspects of plotting his murder. On June the 12th, Richard calls a council meeting for the following day at the Tower of London, claiming that they're going to prepare for the coronation of his nephew, planned for the 22nd of June. On June the 13th, at the council meeting, Richard suddenly turns on a leading nobleman called Lord Hastings, who had been one of Edward IV's main advisors, a very trusted guy who up until that time, he'd also, been quite respected by Richard as well. You can read more about this. I'm just giving you the very kind of bare bones of the whole thing. There is more to it than that. But he suddenly turns on him, accuses him of treason, and has him executed that same day on Tower Hill. So he's beheaded on Tower Hill without trial, in actual fact. So again, this is like Richard of Gloucester. This is a different Richard of Gloucester who's emerging at this point. What is going on? June the 16th, Richard of Gloucester has succeeded in persuading Elizabeth Woodville to release her younger son, Richard of York, into his custody, and he's sent to join his brother in the Tower to apparently help him with preparations. Shortly afterwards, Bishop Stillington of Bath and Wells informs Richard of an existing pre-contract, I'll explain that in a moment, between Edward IV and Lady Eleanor Butler, making the princes, in the words of their time, illegitimate, saying that they haven't been born of a legitimate marriage, which would disqualify them from succeeding to the throne. Okay, so a pre-contract was a kind of engagement, but engagement in the Middle Ages was as formal and binding as marriage. So there's this claim that's just suddenly come out of nowhere that Edward IV had been under this pre-contract and had still been under this pre-contract. It was very secret, when he also secretly married Elizabeth Woodville at the time. So there was some view that the boys were not born of a valid marriage, according to Richard and his advisors. And so he starts to push this. June the 22nd, a sermon is preached outside Old St. Paul's Cathedral, declaring Edward IV's children illegitimate and that the nearest successor is Richard of Gloucester. So June the 26th, following a petition by the citizens of London to him to take up the throne, one suspects some manoeuvring behind the scenes, I feel, Richard publicly declares the boys illegitimate. Parliament later agrees with him and passes a law to confirm that, and he has himself proclaimed King Richard III. On July the 6th, Richard and his wife Anne Neville are crowned at Westminster Abbey. Richard and Anne do what all new monarchs do at that time. They set off on a tour of England called a Royal Progress. So they set off on their tour up north. In the meantime, the princes are turned from monarch and brother into prisoners. And they, at first, when they had been taken to the Tower, and even in the first part of their imprisonment, they had been allowed pretty much all over the Tower complex. But during those months of July to about the middle of August, they gradually began to be withdrawn within the closer confines of the inner parts of the Tower, and then were seen less and less, and eventually by mid-August they were not being seen at all. Now, what we have to say also is that it's not necessarily widely believed by everybody at that time or now that the boys were in fact killed. And if you are thinking of the bones that were dug up under the White Tower, there is no proof yet that those actually are the bones of the two boys. We'll look at that evidence in a little while. The popular belief at the time was that, however, that many people in England believed that the boys were dead. And there are various chronicles that write at the time. I'm not going to go into them too much. You can go and research the chronicles. Some of them reliable, some of them definitely not reliable. But some of them, there was a chronicle written in, there's actually a chronicle, a diary written in 1483 that said Prince Edward and his brother were taken to the inner rooms of the tower and day by day began to be seen less behind the bars and the windows until they stopped appearing altogether. Another one, a French chronicler wrote, look at what has happened since the death of King Edward. His courageous children have been killed and the crown has gone to their murderer. That was written in 1484. In 1512, so quite a while later, this is under the Tudor monarchy, the Great Chronicle of London says the children were seen shooting and playing in the garden until Easter. After Easter, there was much whispering among the people that the king had put the children to death. Although Easter, probably they've got the timings a bit mixed up there. One thing that comes to mind, though, some people had said that the two boys had fallen off a bridge. Some people said that Prince Edward had probably become ill and had died naturally, and Prince Richard, his brother, was secretly taken abroad. Also, it's worth pointing out that plenty of Tower employees would be able to testify to when the boys were last seen and what was going on, in spite of later claims that the boys were smuggled out alive. So even back then, there was some debate over whether it was death, whether it was murder, or whether they were kind of spirited off somewhere. What's interesting is that people called for the king to produce the boys to dispel the rumours either way, whether they died of illness or been murdered, and they got blank silence. Now, they got blank silence from Richard III, but also, for those of you who might favour Henry Tudor as the other suspects, they got blank silence from Henry as well, despite the fact that his regime was doing everything they could to discredit Richard and the Yorkists afterwards. But Henry never launched an investigation into what happened to the princes. He never publicly accused anyone for it. The only person who was executed connected with the crimes, his execution was not actually anything to do with it. In the charges against him, we'll come to those in just a moment. So there has been this kind of royal cover-up at the time, both from Richard III and then from Henry Tudor, which is very strange. Okay, what we're going to do now, if you go to quickly through image 6, if you're following the images, and then to image 7. So we're going to look at the suspects, and I'm going to give you information, motive, and opportunity for each of these. Right, let's start obviously with our prime suspect, and that, of course, is Richard III. Okay, let me just get my notes on him. Right, I mean, obviously, his motive. What is his motive? Well, he is the king who has just usurped the throne, like so many other monarchs in time before him. His rival, the guy he's kicked off the throne, is alive and living under his control. But there is an ever-present threat when you have usurped the throne, as Henry VII was also very aware of, that they might somehow be sprung from prison and used to mount a rebellion against you and kick you off the throne. And Richard III, remember we said that he was a man of his time. He'd seen that with his brother Edward IV. Edward IV had to get rid of his rival Henry VI in the end. The king was murdered, most probably on Edward IV's orders, in the Tower of London. So even in the Tower of London, you weren't safe. Okay, so Richard had seen that happen. Richard, his brother, get rid of his rival. So Richard III knows that the boys could be used against him. They could later on become the source of a rebellion. They could overthrow him. So there's the motive. But here's the weird thing, and that is the boys had been declared illegitimate, and that had been accepted by Parliament, and they'd even passed a law to say the boys were illegitimate. Okay, and that basically meant that legally everybody would see them as not being able to succeed to the throne. You would not be able to put them on the throne successfully if you managed to kick Richard III off the throne. So technically, legally, he was safe and would not have reason to get rid of the boys. This is one of the things that most Richard III supporters would say. You know, why would he need to do it? Well, that's for us to kind of think about and debate. It's a bit of an odd one. Why did he need to do that? Was he paranoid about it? Could he not rest easy on that throne of his, knowing that there was a possibility that somebody could perhaps re-legitimize them at some point? Who knows? Opportunity. Actually, before I go on to opportunity, I've just got 3 examples of historical precedent, things that happened before that he was following the same pattern of. Edward II in the 14th century was killed on the orders of his wife, Isabella of France, and her lover, Roger Mortimer. Richard II at the end of the 14th century had been killed on the orders of the guy who usurped him, Henry IV. And as I say, Henry VI had been killed on the orders of Edward IV. So why would Richard act any differently? Well, we have this legal thing about the boys being declared illegitimate as countering that. Opportunity. In August 1483, when the boys disappeared, Richard was away on tour. However, his best friend, Buckingham, the Duke of Buckingham, stayed in London. Buckingham was the Constable of the Tower of London. Okay, so he had ample opportunity to go in and out of the Tower of London and access to the boys. Buckingham stayed in London, and he could well have ordered the deaths on Richard's behalf. Richard had plenty of people to do the deed. The king, however, was the only one who actually had the power at that point to order the boys' deaths. Nobody would have dared to murder the boys without Richard's permission, because that would have got them into very deep trouble. When he was challenged to prove the boys had not been murdered, as I said earlier on, he said and did nothing, but most Londoners believed the king was responsible. The murder did seriously, well, the disappearance and presumed murder of the boys seriously damaged Richard's reputation. Those who believed that the boys had been murdered on his orders were absolutely horrified. They took the same highly scandalized, negative, horrified view of killing children as we hold today. So we have to remember that. But in actual fact, in my opinion, because I do believe that Richard was responsible for this, but in my opinion, this is what turned the tide against Richard and led to his death at Bosworth in 1485. In actual fact, I think it was a massive mistake. However, you know, he might have seen it, if he was responsible, he might have seen it as not having any choice. He had to do something. Who knows? A witness, a couple of things to say. By the end of the year, Queen Elizabeth Woodville was prepared to support a campaign by Henry Tudor, the leading Lancastrian, and a marriage between him and her daughter Elizabeth of York to try and overthrow Richard. Now, when we're trying to think about, did the boys die, or were they murdered, or were they spirited away somehow? Elizabeth Woodville herself truly believed them to be dead by September, because that's when she started plotting with the Lancastrians and with Lady Margaret Beaufort, who was Henry Tudor's mother, one of the most powerful ladies in England, and the Duke of Buckingham, who apparently was one of the people who was the most scandalized by the idea that the boys might have been killed. Remember, he was also one of our chief suspects, so how does that fit? Okay, but by September, he was actively plotting with Elizabeth Woodville and Lady Margaret Beaufort and Henry Tudor to overthrow Richard III. I'm convinced that Elizabeth of York would not have been involved in a plot like that to put Henry Tudor on the throne unless she knew that she no longer had these 2 sons. So that to me suggests very strong evidence that the boys were dead by whatever means, illness or murder. Okay, the campaign did fail in the autumn, what was known as the Buckingham Rebellion, and Elizabeth eventually came out of sanctuary. She came, hi Barbers, lovely to see you all. Thanks for coming in. Okay, so yes, now an objection in Richard's defense. Why would Elizabeth later on that year have come out of sanctuary and joined Richard at court with her daughter if she thought him so dangerous? Well, I know some people might think she didn't have a choice. You know, it's best to keep your enemy in your sight. Who knows? Okay, let's move on. We're going to consider Henry Tudor. So if you just come in at this point in the talk and you want to follow the images that we're following, at the very top of the chat board at the very beginning of the talk, I posted a link for a PDF of images that we're following. Okay, so you can go and download those. And we're now on slide 8, and we're looking at the suspects in the mystery of the princes in the tower. Okay, so our next suspect is Henry VII. That's image 8 on the PDF. Okay, a lot of people think that he was probably the one who did it. And I'm quite surprised how many people do. Well, let's think about motive. Why would he want to see the boys dead? Well, after winning the Battle of Bosworth in 1485 and the death of Richard, Henry was crowned the new King of England. He founded the Tudor dynasty. Many other people still said that they had a stronger claim to the throne than Henry, and that was true. His claim to the throne was decidedly dodgy, in actual fact, and he was quick to eliminate any opposition. We see this much later in his campaigns against Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck. Every time somebody came forward claiming to be one of the boys, he dealt with it pretty quickly and publicly as well. Lots of people, however, think that Henry might have killed the princes to secure his right to the crown. He actually needed the boys out of the way as much as Richard III did, because he had less of a claim to the throne than either of the boys or their sister, Elizabeth of York, in actual fact, whom, of course, he'd married. And, of course, he had them re-legitimised as well. So he had a decidedly dodgy claim to the throne. And so he had as much of a reason to need the boys out of the way. So there are two theories. One is that somehow, maybe through Lady Margaret Beaufort's machinations, he'd managed to get somebody into the Tower of London to get rid of the boys in order to have them out of the way when he led his campaign against Richard III. And that started, as I say, in the September with the plotting of 1483, that same year. The other theory is that the boys were somehow still alive in the tower, but nobody was admitting it, by 1485, and that sometime after that time, Henry as king now had the opportunity and the power to order their deaths. Those are the two theories that are usually put forward. The only thing that perhaps would be in support of the theory of Henry VII, I think, is the fact that he wiped out all his further opponents as soon as possible after his accession. Could it have been that the boys were still alive and they were part of that campaign? Let's think about opportunity, okay? Now, we have to understand that Henry, at the time of the boys' disappearance and supposed murder, was a penniless refugee with no power, okay? He was on the run in France. Richard was hunting him down, okay? He didn't come to England himself until 1485. He tried in the October-November of 1483 during the Buckingham Rebellion, because the idea was that Buckingham was supporting him, as were many knights and nobles from the south of England, to replace Richard III. But it didn't happen because the British weather got in the way and his ships were blown back to France. So he kind of turned around and said, okay, that's not going to happen. We can't get there. And the Buckingham Rebellion also failed, and on receiving the news, that kind of put the nail in the coffin of him even trying to get to England. He said, no, that's it, we're going back. And so it wasn't until 2 years later, 1485, that he actually was able to successfully bring a fleet and get across the Channel and land in South Wales and mount his actual campaign. So opportunity, very difficult. At the time of the boys' disappearance in August, they didn't even have the cooperation of the Duke of Buckingham. So what opportunity would he have had to get somebody into the Tower to actually do the deed? Well, very little, except perhaps, as the theory is put forward, Lady Margaret Beaufort was able to pull some strings. And there is a surprising amount of people who actually think that Lady Margaret Beaufort had something to do with this and had enough power to try and get somebody into the Tower and get rid of the boys ahead of the campaign or even afterwards. So that's, it's very, very intriguing, really. At least opportunity, I would say, from Henry's side, little to none. Motive, lots, okay? But also, let's have a look at some evidence. As I say, he was in exile. He was on the run. It was very difficult, some people have said, to arrange the murder from France with no access to the boys. Also, you need to balance that against the wide belief in the death of the princes in August 1483 and their failure to appear after summer of that year. I think it suggests that Henry VII, or Henry Tudor as he was, by joining in the campaign to try and get rid of Richard III, also believed the boys to be dead. He was never actively accused of the crime by anybody, and the boys were never produced after the Londoners heard of his victory. Also, in the traditional narrative, the two chaps who were supposed to have been the ones who actually did the deed, two guys called Dighton and Forrest, they were given important posts and rewards by Henry Tudor during his reign, which is interesting because some people have said that that would imply that Henry Tudor had something to do with the boys dying, and this was a reward. However, although Henry Tudor had as much to gain as King Richard from the deaths of the children, in 1483 Henry was not necessarily a genuine contender to the throne. His kind of prospects as an alternative king to Richard were not particularly promising. He didn't have widespread support. In fact, a lot of support didn't come his way until he'd successfully taken Shrewsbury in 1485 on his way to Bosworth. So, he didn't have the level of support that would suggest that he would actually be able to actually pull this whole thing off. And also, let me just read you this. One primary reason it's unlikely that Henry Tudor was involved in the slaying of the princes is the very fact that not only did he marry the boys' sister, but their mother was instrumental in the politicking that brought him to the crown. By the end of 1483, often considered the period the princes were done away with, Elizabeth Woodville began conspiring with Henry Tudor's mother, Margaret Beaufort, to put Henry Tudor on the throne of England. The provision of this, of course, was that Henry would have to marry the prince's sister, Elizabeth of York, a concession Henry was only too happy to agree to. Why would Elizabeth Woodville and Elizabeth of York, her daughter, have anything to do with Henry Tudor if they thought that he had been instrumental in the death of the boys? So that's something we need to consider. But let's have a look at the other suspects as well. So if you're following the images, go to image 9. And this is Henry Stafford, the second Duke of Buckingham, who had been one of Richard's best friends, his closest advisor, but turned against the king in the autumn. However, up until that time, at the time when Richard was usurping the throne and the boys were being withdrawn, he had a lot of opportunity. He had the opportunity to murder the boys when he stayed in London while the king went off on his progress, on his tour of England. What motive might he have had? Well, he was a supporter of Richard. He had a lot to gain from Richard staying on the throne. He'd had massive amounts of land and important jobs given to him, such as having control of the military governance of Wales, all sorts of different things he'd been given him. So he'd done pretty well out of the king, I must say. He had supported Richard's usurpation of the throne and may have been willing to carry out Richard's orders to strengthen both Richard's hold on the throne as his own opinion, as his own position. Also, he had a claim to the throne through his family history. He too was descended from one of the sons of King Edward III, as Richard was also. And some people suggest that he might have killed the princes to strengthen his claims. Now, link that to the fact that he actively rebelled against Richard III in the September. Some people have put forward the idea that actually he would have suggested putting himself on the throne once he kicked Richard off it. Let me just grab Ruth's comment here. She said he's the only suspect pictured who clearly has no hands, and there is innocent. Okay. Well, let's go into this. What opportunity did he have? Well, he controlled the Tower of London, and it's very likely he could control some henchmen. Perhaps he could order people to actually do the job. Dyson and Forrest, for example, in the traditional narrative that they were ordered to do the job. Perhaps the Duke of Buckingham was the one that actually did the ordering. Okay. Again, some people accuse him of doing the murder independently, but he would not have dared to murder a king without the express orders of the ruling monarch, no matter how trusted he was by Richard III. I really don't think that was likely. In his defense, he turned against Richard and supported the rebellion at the end of 1483, and his main reason was the murder of the boys and how horrified he was. He thought that was actually drawing a line. Okay, so that's in his defense for not being involved in it. Also, it's evidence that he believed the boys to be dead rather than been spirited away somewhere. He wouldn't have done so if the boys had not been dead. The rebellion's aim was to restore Edward V to the throne originally. Richard failed to produce the boys in order to dispel fears of their murder. But Richard, even after the Buckingham Rebellion failed and Buckingham was executed in early November, having been branded a traitor, Richard never came out and blamed Buckingham for the murders, which is something that you would have expected to happen at the time. But he never was blamed for that murder by Richard or even by Henry, in actual fact. Let's go on to image 10. Lady Margaret Beaufort, I've spoken a little bit about her. Her motive, as suggested by people who think she might have been involved, is about plotting with the Woodvilles, getting rid of Richard and putting her son on the throne. I've already said I think that she would probably have been able to pull some strings, but I think it's unlikely. But I'll leave that out there for you. Opportunity of actually doing it herself, none whatsoever. Okay. Let's go to slide 11, and this is about another person who's involved in this whole story. There's a suggestion that there was a middleman between Richard and the boys' murderers, or between Buckingham, if it was him, and the boys' murderers, a chap called Sir James Tyrrell. He was an English knight, a Yorkist loyalist and trusted servant of King Richard III. He's known for confessing to the murders of the princes under Richard's orders much later on in 1502 under the reign of Henry Tudor. He confessed to the murders. He was being tried for treason for rebelling against Henry Tudor. But although he confessed to the crimes, he was never charged with them. Okay? He had, in terms of motive, supported Richard's usurpation of the throne and may have been willing to carry out Richard's orders to strengthen both Richard's hold on the throne and his own position. And also he had a claim to the throne through his family history and might have killed the princes to strengthen his claims. The other thing I must say about the confession is that it came out under torture and therefore is considered to be highly unreliable. But we have this account, this chronicle that was written by Thomas More much later on. And he is the main source from whom Shakespeare got his account in order to write his play of Richard III. And this is what Thomas More says. King Richard wanted Sir James Tyrrell to carry out his wishes. Tyrrell decided that the princes should be murdered in their beds. He picked Miles Forrest and John Dighton to do the job. About midnight, Forrest and Dighton entered the room where the children lay in their beds and forced the feather bed and pillows hard into their mouths until they stopped breathing. They laid their bodies out naked on the bed. Medieval people slept naked as a rule, okay, so nothing unusual in that, and fetched Sir James to see them. Then he got the murderers to bury them at the bottom of the stairs, deep in the ground under a heap of stones, and later a priest dug up the bodies and moved them to a place which only he knew. And this is from Thomas More, whose account has been proved to be highly unreliable and highly biased in favour of Henry VII. He hated Richard III. He'd been brought up by a chap whose name completely escapes me, who had been imprisoned by Richard III. So he had every reason, working for the Tudor monarchs, to do everything he could to paint Richard III in a bad light and those connected with him. So we don't know. The only real account we have about Sir James Tyrrell is that coming from Thomas More. So that, and we know that's highly dodgy. So we can't really trust that evidence. Okay, that's asking you to just bear that in mind as you decide. Okay, so those are the main suspects. You've had the narrative, you've had the suspects, you've had evidence, opportunity, and motive for each one. We've got a few minutes left, so I'm just going to go into the finding of the bones, and we'll have a look at what happened there. I'll do this as quickly as I can, and then I'll throw the question out to you to decide what you think. And if you're watching the recording and you want to give your opinion, you can always leave a comment below the video and tell me what you think, and that would be fantastic. Okay, so if you go to image 12, if you're following the PDF of images, there is a tradition, obviously, that the bones were found in the White Tower, and this plaque is there. The tradition of the tower has always pointed out this as the stair underneath which the bones of Edward V and his brother were found in Charles II's time, and from whence they were removed to Westminster Abbey. They there is a story that these bones were discovered deep under a staircase, and that they, by some workmen, about 2 meters down in a box, there was a bundle of different bones, and that they were shown to King Charles II in the 1770s, and that he believed them to be the bones of the two boys and ordered them to be reinterred in what is now Innocents Corner. If you want to go to image 14, just jump 13 for a moment, you can see the memorial that was erected to them in Innocents Corner in Westminster Abbey, and that and I've said the princes in the urn ? Because they don't even know whether this is actually the boys or not. Certainly, there's been no actual proof. If you go to image 13, however, let's have a look at what they've got to do with bones. This is a diagram from one of the very good history textbooks I sometimes teach from, and it shows you in the grey shaded areas the bones that were found at the time. Now, in 1933, the bones were opened. They opened the urn and had a look at the bones, and with the forensic knowledge they had at the time, experts reckoned that there were two children, there were human bones, although 1 or 2 animal bones were found, and that they were appropriate for boys roughly of 11 to 13 years. They said that there was a stain on one of the skulls that indicated that the person had been suffocated, and they basically accepted that this was probably the murdered boys. But much later in the 1950s, a couple of experts of that time were not allowed to look at the bones themselves, but they looked at photographs, and they raised doubts about the age of the bones in terms of what ages they were, and basically said, oh, well, the stain on the skull's got nothing to do with it, and so we don't really know. And that's the only real examination that's been done on the bones of the two boys. Now, of course, people often say, well, what about DNA? Why can't we have DNA tests to find out if they are indeed the boys themselves? Well, the Abbey says basically, even if you do get a DNA test, it's not going to prove either way whether the boys were murdered. You might actually say that they were actually the boys. That's what I meant. That it might actually prove that these were two people who had been murdered, but you might actually link them to the royal family. You might actually say that, you know, these are descendants of the Yorkist family, that they probably were Edward IV's sons, but it's not going to tell you how they died, and it's not going to tell you who killed them. It's not going to solve the mystery. The only bit of it that it would solve is who they are, in terms of linking them DNA-wise to the royal family. We know that following the discovery of Richard III, we know that there's a historian, again, whose name is gone, John Ashdown Hill, I think it is, who was working with Philippa Langley. He went on a hunt for a descendant of Edward IV, and he found one. I'm going to read you this. The DNA obviously cannot come from the boys' direct descendants, since the two of them, Edward V and Prince Richard of York, were assumed to have disappeared before they reached adulthood, married and had their own children. But the boys' maternal grandmother, Jacquetta Woodville, is the confirmed ancestor of a modern-day English opera singer, a woman named Elizabeth Roberts, whose female line mitochondrial DNA scientists were able to isolate. Elizabeth Roberts is the 16 times great-granddaughter of Jacquetta Woodville, also called Jacquetta of Luxembourg. So they've got someone who they can, you know, match the DNA in the bones to, if they were going to do that experiment to see whether they really were the boys. But again, as the Dean of Westminster said, it's not actually going to do anything to solve the issue. Is, you know, did they die naturally, and was it all covered up? Were they murdered? We don't really know. It's not going to provide that answer. Okay, in the last minute of my talk now, I'd like to invite you to just quickly whiz through image 15, which is Shakespeare's Richard III saying, "Did I do it?" This is your chance to give your opinion. So if you go to image 16 now, who done it? If there was a murderer, was it Richard III, Henry Tudor, the Duke of Buckingham, Sir James Tyrrell? Who was the one responsible in the end? And image 17 asks you the question, verdict, time to decide. Was Richard a villain or the victim of bad press? Did he have the boys murdered, or do you think it was somebody else? Can I invite you in this last moment to give your verdict? I can hear the cogs of deliberation going round. Okay, Lucy's saying, I think Buckingham on the orders of Richard III. Okay. Would anyone else like to volunteer a verdict? And of course, if you're watching the recording, do obviously leave a comment below with your ideas on this as well. Okay, well, thank you, Lucy, for your opinion. Here's Ruth. She says, Polly says they would be able to tell if they've been strangled or suffocated by the little bones at the top of the neck. Okay. It's unfortunate that the Abbey and the Queen have both said this is not going to happen. But yeah, it would be great, wouldn't it, to be able to have a look at that. I was thinking Buckingham by the orders of Richard III also. Okay, Ruth, all three of us think an order of Richard III. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I personally would agree with you. I think Ricardians would argue vehemently against it, and I'd be interested to hear people's opinions if they want to carry on the debate below. Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. That brings our talk to an end this evening. Now I know this all works. I will be doing another talk next Friday. We're going to be delving into the intricacies and the mysteries surrounding medieval food, dining, and table manners. So if you want to find out how people ate, whether they had table manners at all, then do come and join me next Friday at 7 o'clock for my next free talk. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining me. Do share about these talks if you enjoy them. And thank you, everybody. Stay safe and stay well. Take care, Aya. Thank you. Bye, Ruth. Thank you. Bye, Lucy. Thank you. Bye for now. Bye, Toby. Take care. Thanks for joining me. Bye for now. Thanks, everybody. Good night to you all.